So I wanted to add on to your video about stress and trauma by talking specifically about PTSD and dissociation. I think it's very important for all of us here to understand stress because we're all going to be stressed. But let's talk about when stress goes to that next level, up to that traumatic level, and some of the symptoms that are involved there. So these are the criteria in the current edition of the DSM for PTSD. As you can see, the first part is about exposure to an actual threat, okay? You actually have to have the traumatic event occur. Now, one of the nice things about the DSM-5 is that we always have our direct experiencing the event, but now it's witnessing it, learning that it occurred to a close family member or friend, or repeated and extreme exposures to adverse details, particularly our first responders and police officers. 2, 3, and 4 are new. Especially if you look at how the DSM has changed over the history of the diagnoses back from combat stress fatigue and the like. So the first part is you have to have the trauma, but after that we have to have the presence of one or more of these intrusive symptoms. So intrusive means that they're not bidden, they're not wanted, right? So the first one is to have distressing memories that are intrusive, thus involuntary, that occur routinely. You could also have these through dreams. But number 3 is the one that most people think about when they think about PTSD, and that's our flashbacks. Now, if you'll look, it calls flashbacks a dissociative reaction. So there's kind of several things I want to talk about here. 1, what is dissociation? And 2, what is a flashback? And then 3, what are the other kinds of dissociative reactions that we might see if we're studying psychopathology? So we're going to get back to that in a second. The other things are intense distress at the exposure to any cues. So that would be distress because of triggering events or marked psychological reactions to triggering events. So A, you have to have the trauma. B, you have to have some of these intrusive symptoms, particularly that you have to re-experience what happened to you or relive it in some of these memory forms. C is that you then avoid anything that's associated with the trauma. Well, that makes sense. We are a learning animal, right? Something bad happened to me. Every time I'm reminded of it, these bad symptoms occur. So now I'm just going to avoid stuff. And then after that, we have negative alterations in your mood and alterations in your arousal and reactivity, okay? So if I were to ask you, what are the real hallmark symptoms of PTSD? It's going to be A, B, and C. That you have to have experienced trauma, that you have to have some kind of intrusive symptoms where you relive or re-experience that trauma, and then you thus avoid any of the stimuli associated with that, okay? But let's get back to this dissociative reaction piece. So what is dissociative reaction? Or what is dissociation? Dissociation is a separation or a detachment from reality in some sort of way. So when we talk about dissociative reactions, that's what's called a flashback. Now, I think it's important to point out that a flashback is both intrusive and dissociative because usually in a flashback, there's a period of time where time and or reality are suspended or changed. So I might remember something that's traumatic and it feels like it's actually happening to me in this time. Well, that means reality has been suspended because it's not actually still happening to you. And that's the difference between a flashback and just a distressing memory. We all have memories that make us feel awful after we remember them. But the difference is the flashback is a memory where it feels like it's actually happening to me again. And that time reality piece is distorted. Now, there's a really good pop culture moment for this that I want to show you all. That is a clip from the movie Wreck-It Ralph, and it's a really good, again, pop culture representation of what a flashback might feel like or look like to someone. So this is a clip from Wreck-It Ralph, and hopefully most of you have seen it, but it shouldn't be too spoilery, all right?
You are one dynamite gal.
Wow. You are one dynamite gal. One dynamite gal. Dynamite gal. Dynamite gal. Dynamite.
So our character here is triggered, right, by a phrase that her loved one used for her. And then the reason why it's a traumatic memory for her is because her loved one was killed in front of her. So hearing that phrase again makes her have a flashback, and we know it's a flashback because there's a dissociative element, right? Where all of those memories are intrusive, unbidden, unwelcome, right? They come back to her in such a way that she screams, right? Tries to avoid an imagined enemy by actually shifting the plane. She then is very upset. She lands the plane. She kicks the other person, the other character out of the plane, right? I think this is an excellent example of what a flashback looks like. Another way to think about this is if I burn my hand on the stove, chances are I could tell you about the time I burned my hand, and it might be upsetting, but I don't actually feel my hand get hot again. I don't feel the sores, that sort of thing. But in flashback memories and dissociative memories, you do. You would actually feel the pain again in your flesh when you talked about it, all right? And part of that has to do with where these memories are stored, and they're stored in a different area. Let's take a look. So here's a picture of the human brain, right? Taken from a website. I'll send you the link, or I'll put the link on our course page. And what this really has to do with the amygdala. And see, the amygdala is deep, deep, deep down in the brain. The amygdala has a role in memory, but not in normal or normative memories. In fact, there's a really good Forbes article where Natalie Engelbrecht, I don't know her personally, so hopefully that's close enough, who is a therapist, actually talks about how traumatic memories are stored and how different that is. And it's basically that when a trauma occurs, the amygdala, which is usually involved in emotions, encodes the traumatic memory, while the hippocampus doesn't really as much as normal. And the hippocampus is usually where memories are stored. Again, these normal memories would then move to the frontal lobe, right? So again, normally we would have some activation here in the hippocampus. They'd move into the frontal lobe. We mainly talk about this as it's the language centers of the brain, and thus it allows for the processing and integration of memories. But when trauma happens and the amygdala gets involved, that disrupts what happens to our memories. And because of that, they tend to be not only frozen in time, but they also tend to be paired with all of your sensory data. And that sensory data is the problem, because that's why I can feel the things happening to me, and why reality gets distorted is because it's coming with all of this extra information that is not the way that normal, even bad memories, but normal memories are felt. So let's get back to the other types of dissociation. Now we've talked about what a dissociative reaction is. What other kinds of dissociation? Well, remember, dissociation means a detachment from reality or a separation. We can also have a separation from oneself, and there's two kinds of this: depersonalization and derealization. Your textbook talks briefly about each of these, but just remember, depersonalization is when you are detached from your personhood. That makes it easier to remember. So you are detached from yourself, such as your mind or your body, or you might feel like you are actually an outside observer watching yourself. In fact, many trauma survivors talk about that it feels as if they have drifted up out of their body and can actually look down upon it. Derealization is an alteration in the experience of the external world, so that the world seems unreal in some kind of way. We can also talk about dissociation as a separation from our memory, and that's where we get dissociative amnesia, of which there are several types that we'll talk about momentarily, and then separation from your identity, and that's where we get dissociative fugue and dissociative identity disorder. So dissociative amnesia, again, amnesia is a loss of some kind of personal information or memory, and this dissociation or dissociative amnesia usually occurs after something very stressful or traumatic. You have some typologies here. Just make sure you can tell these apart. Dissociative fugue, which by the way is my favorite disorder in the whole DSM. It's incredibly rare. I likely will never have a client who had dissociative fugue. I hope to someday meet someone who had a client who had dissociative fugue. But dissociative fugue, if you know anything about music, toccata and fugue is a famous piece of classical music, and fugue means movement. So anytime that you see the word fugue, that means movement. So this is some kind of dissociation with movement. That's how you can remember it. And it's usually some kind of amnesia about who you are your identity, including your memories and components of who you are, uh, combined with some kind of travel away from home. This is called a fugue state when you travel. The reason why this disorder is my favorite is because it really speaks to the power of your brain. What happens is that your brain or your consciousness recognizes that something terrible has happened and that you are no longer safe. And so what it does is it takes your memories and who you are and all of that kind of stuff and basically puts that away. And in this kind of dissociative detachment where this is beginning, you pack a bag and you move far away. And when you kind of regain consciousness, you don't have access to your childhood memories or anything like that about who you are as a person. So someday you just kind of wake up and you're a waitress at the Waffle House in the middle of nowhere, and you've always been here, and you've always done this. And you don't really remember your childhood, but really, I mean, lots of people don't remember their childhood, right? The problem with dissociative fugue is, to be honest, it's very rare, but is it? We don't actually know, because what has to happen is that those kind of pushed away memories and parts of your identity have to leach forward, and that usually is what happens. They start to leach forward, and then the person becomes distressed because, wait, what is this? What is this? What is this? And then they get identified, right? For all we know, there are lots of people who they just never have the memories come back, right? I will tell you, I've met lots of people who don't remember parts of their childhood, and a lot of times it is because of trauma. It's not always. So if you're watching this video and you're like, well, I don't remember parts of my childhood, I don't want you to just automatically assume that's because there was some trauma there. There could be other things, but sometimes it is because there was a great deal of trauma, and that's why this is talked about while we talk about trauma. So the last one that's on the video is dissociative identity disorder. You may have heard this as multiple personality disorder, but we call it dissociative identity disorder now because it's really about a dissociation, a detachment from your primary identity with the development of other identities. I will say one of the problems with DID is that we as a culture seem to be fascinated by it. It's very rare. It does happen. In fact, I was in someone's office doing some household kinds of stuff, and he found out what I do, and then immediately started to tell me about his ex-wife, who appeared to have dissociative identity disorder. So it's not unheard of, but it is not as common as something as like depression or anxiety. But we tend as a society to be fascinated by DID in almost a problematic sense. There are several pieces of literature and movies that kind of paint people with DID as untrustable, monstrous even. There was a recent movie that even kind of did that. That was really problematic. So I don't want to go too far in depth because we have plenty of other things to talk about, but if you're interested in DID, there's plenty more to learn. I would particularly point you to this post-traumatic stress model that's in your book. I apologize for the graphic being so fuzzy, but it's in the chapter on dissociation, so you can look at it more. Basically, what it talks to is that we find that in the post-traumatic stress model for DID, that children get exposed to major traumas, and these traumas allow them to develop a capacity to dissociate, and to develop a capacity to dissociate so well, they get so good at it, that they are able to wall off their past experience, develop different memory systems, and that's what allows for this development of other personalities. Now, as I do have a multicultural component to this course, I do want to point out that there's also the socio-cognitive model for DID, and this is that we tend to only find DID in cultures that have portrayals of DID, and that in cultures that don't have any kind of representation of DID, there's no persons who say that they have these symptoms. So this really relates to a topic that you're going to learn about in the Waters text called Symptom Pool. Students tend to struggle a little bit with the symptom pool. So we're not really going to talk about it here yet. I'm going to let you get to that when you get to the Waters text. But when you start seeing the phrase symptom pool show up, I want you to make sure you understand that. And if you don't, make sure you reach out to me. And we're going to talk more about symptom pool this semester as well. But basically, when there's some kind of distress going on in a person, they unconsciously, and it's very important you get that it's unconsciously, seem to make use of the symptoms that their culture expects for that distress. And that if some symptoms aren't in the symptom pool, then that person doesn't seem to have the ability to display them. All right. But we're going to talk way more about culture later. But hopefully this helped you understand some of the dissociative stuff. And again, if this is the stuff you're most interested in, there's plenty more to learn. So I'll see you on the internet.